I need to tell you about the moment my marriage ended, and it happened over breadsticks at Olive Garden. I'm James, 32, been married to Gia for 6 years, and I thought we had the perfect life. Nice apartment in the suburbs, 2 cars, decent jobs. We were even talking about kids soon. And then she dropped a bomb that shattered everything I thought I knew about the woman sleeping next to me every night. We were sitting in our usual booth by the window, Friday night tradition. Waiter had just brought the salad and breadsticks. I was debating between chicken parmigiana and shrimp scampi, completely clueless about what was coming. And then Gia looked up from her menu with this weird smile and said the words that would end us. "I've decided I'm going to be a surrogate mother for Godwin." She announced it like she was telling me she'd picked up groceries, casual as anything. And I laughed because surely this was a joke. But she wasn't laughing back, just staring at me with this expectant look like I was supposed to congratulate her or something. Godwin, and let me be crystal clear here, is her ex-boyfriend from college, the guy she dated for 3 years before me, the one she always called her first real love, in that nostalgic tone that made my stomach turn. And now she wanted to carry his child, grow his baby inside her body for 9 months. And she was telling me this over unlimited breadsticks like it was no big deal at all. I put down my fork because suddenly I wasn't hungry anymore, and I asked her to repeat what she just said because surely I'd misheard. Surely my wife wasn't telling me she wanted to be a surrogate for her ex-boyfriend, but she repeated it word for word, even adding that Godwin and his wife Melissa couldn't have children naturally, and they'd been trying for years, and it was breaking their hearts, and she wanted to help them. I sat there processing this while the restaurant buzzed around me. Families laughing, couples on dates, normal people having normal Friday nights. And I asked the obvious question, when exactly were you planning to discuss this with me? And she looked confused like I was being unreasonable. She told me she'd met with them twice already, coffee last week and dinner 3 days ago. She'd researched the medical procedures, she'd made up her mind, and I was just finding out now over pasta. I asked her why it had to be her, why her ex specifically. Weren't there professional surrogates? Wasn't there anyone else in the world who could do this? And she got defensive immediately, saying I was being jealous and immature, that this was about helping people create a family, that I should be proud of her for being so selfless and compassionate. Selfless. That was the word she used. Like volunteering to carry your ex-boyfriend's baby while married to someone else was some humanitarian mission. Like I was the villain for having questions about this insane situation. The waiter came back to take our order, and I just stared at him blankly until he awkwardly walked away. And I leaned forward and asked Gia if she was getting paid for this. And she looked offended, saying no, of course not. This was a gift. She was doing this out of love for old friends who were suffering. Out of love, those exact words. And something cold clicked in my brain right then, because this wasn't about helping strangers or even friends. This was about Godwin, specifically Godwin, her first love, her ex, the one that got away. And suddenly 6 years of marriage felt like a lie. I asked her point blank if she still had feelings for him, and she rolled her eyes at me, said I was being paranoid, that she loved me, that this had nothing to do with our marriage, that I was making everything about my insecurities instead of supporting her noble decision. Noble decision, like I was supposed to smile and nod while my wife got pregnant with another man's child, like that was a normal thing supportive husbands do. And I could feel anger building, but I kept it down, kept my voice level, because I was forming a plan even then. I told her I needed time to think about it, that this was huge and affected both of us, that we needed to discuss it properly. And she said fine, but her tone made it clear she thought I was overreacting, that she expected me to come around eventually, that my opinion was more formality than actual factor in her decision. We ate the rest of the meal in silence, or rather she ate, and I pushed food around my plate, and I paid the bill with our joint credit card. One of the last times I'd use it, though I didn't know that yet. We drove home separately because we'd taken both cars, her from her office and me from the gym. And the whole drive I was thinking about what I was going to do, how I was going to handle this. Because one thing was crystal clear, my wife had checked out of our marriage. She'd made a major life decision without me. She'd been meeting with her ex behind my back, and she expected me to just accept it. Instead of going home, I drove to my brother's place across town, showed up at his door at 9 p.m. on a Friday night. And he took one look at my face and let me in without questions. I told him everything, the Olive Garden conversation, Gia's secret meetings with Godwin, her complete disregard for my feelings, and my brother got angrier and angrier on my behalf, saying things like, "Is she insane?" and "You can't let her do this." But I was already past anger. I was in cold calculation mode now. I told my brother I had a plan, that I was going to tell Gia I'd thought about it and I was okay with it, that I supported her decision, And while she was busy playing happy family with Godwin and Melissa, I was going to quietly file for divorce, freeze our accounts, remove her from my insurance, and be gone before she realized what was happening. My brother looked at me like I'd grown a second head, asked if I was sure, if maybe we should try couples therapy first, and I laughed because you don't need therapy when your wife wants to have her ex-boyfriend's baby. You need a lawyer. I slept on my brother's couch that night. Didn't even tell Gia where I was. Let her wonder. Let her worry. And when she called at midnight, I didn't answer. When she texted asking if I was okay, I just replied, staying at my brother's. Need space. Talk tomorrow. And left it at that. I lay there in the dark thinking about all the signs I'd missed. All the times she'd mentioned Godwin casually. All the times she'd been on her phone late at night. All the times she'd said she was meeting friends but been vague about who. And I realized this had been building for a while. This wasn't sudden. This was something she'd been planning and wanting, and I'd been completely blind to it. The next morning, I woke up with clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed to protect myself, protect my assets, protect my future, because Gia had made her choice, and it wasn't me. It was never going to be me again. Not really. Not after this. I drove home around noon, found Gia in the kitchen making lunch, and she looked at me hopefully like I was about to tell her I'd come to my senses and would support her surrogacy plan. And I almost felt bad for what I was about to do. Almost. But then I remembered her face at Olive Garden, how casual she'd been, how little my feelings mattered, and I smiled and told her I'd thought about it, and if this was really what she wanted, I'd support her. The relief on her face was genuine. She hugged me, told me she knew I'd understand eventually, that this was going to be beautiful, that Godwin and Melissa were so grateful, and I hugged her back knowing it was probably the last time I'd hold my wife. Because the woman in my arms wasn't my wife anymore. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize, someone who'd chosen her ex-boyfriend over her husband and convinced herself it was noble. I spent the rest of that weekend being the perfect, supportive husband, asking questions about the procedure, nodding along when she talked about timelines and medical appointments, even agreeing to meet Godwin and Melissa for dinner the following week, all while mentally cataloging everything we owned, every asset we had, every account in both our names, preparing for the war she didn't see coming. On Monday morning, I called in sick to work, something I never did, and I drove to the law offices of Victoria Hale, a divorce attorney my brother had found over the weekend, known for being ruthless, and I told her everything, every detail, every text message, every lie, and she leaned back in her chair and said, "Let's make sure you come out of this okay." And for the first time since Friday night, I felt like I was going to survive this. Like I wasn't the victim in this story, but the one who got away. Victoria Hale didn't waste any time, and by Tuesday afternoon, I was signing divorce papers in her downtown office. Papers that would be served to Gia at her workplace within 48 hours. And I remember Victoria looking at me and saying this was going to get ugly, that Gia would panic when she realized she'd lost control, and I just nodded because I was ready. I'd spent 3 days being the perfect, supportive husband while secretly preparing to burn our marriage to the ground, and honestly, it felt good, it felt powerful, it felt like I was taking control of my own life instead of being a passenger in Gia's fantasy. Wednesday morning, I went to our bank, the one where we'd had a joint account for 5 years, where we deposited wedding gift checks and saved for vacations and kept our emergency fund, and I moved every single dollar I'd personally contributed into a new account at a different bank, left her with access to only her own deposits, completely legal according to Victoria. And then I called our insurance company and removed her from my health insurance policy, from my car insurance, from everything. And with each phone call, I felt lighter, like I was shedding weight I didn't even know I'd been carrying. Thursday morning arrived, and I went to work like normal, sat through meetings, answered emails, made small talk with coworkers, all while knowing that in a few hours Gia's entire world was going to implode. And right around 2 p.m. my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria that just said served, with a thumbs up emoji, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I was shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. From the realization that there was no going back now. I'd done it. I'd filed for divorce, and my wife didn't even see it coming. I got 17 calls from Gia between 2:30 and 5 p.m., didn't answer a single one. Let every call go to voicemail, and the messages went from confused to angry to desperate to enraged. She was screaming in some of them, saying I was insane, that I was overreacting, that we needed to talk about this like adults. But the time for talking had passed the moment she decided to carry her ex-boyfriend's baby without consulting her husband. I stayed late at work on purpose, didn't go home until almost 8 p.m., And when I pulled up to our apartment building, my brother was already there waiting in his truck like we planned. And we went upstairs together and found the apartment empty, Gia's car gone. But she'd left destruction in her wake. Picture frames smashed on the floor, my clothes thrown everywhere, the TV remote broken in half. Classic signs of someone who'd completely lost control, and my brother just looked around and said, "She took it well," which made me laugh despite everything. I started packing my essentials, clothes and toiletries, and my laptop, important documents from our file cabinet, my grandfather's watch from my nightstand, and I was loading boxes into my brother's truck when Gia pulled up with 2 other people in her car. And even from the parking lot, I could see it was Godwin and Melissa. She'd brought them to confront me, brought her ex-boyfriend and his wife to our home to gang up on me. And the audacity of it was almost impressive. They came upstairs together, this weird little trio, and Gia's face was blotchy from crying, but her eyes were hard and angry. And she demanded to know what I thought I was doing, said I was ruining everything over nothing, that I was being cruel and vindictive. And Godwin stepped forward like he was going to say something. This tall guy with glasses and a receding hairline. Nothing special, honestly. And I just held up my hand and said, "We talk through lawyers now. All of us. You want to communicate with me, you go through Victoria Hale." And I handed Godwin one of Victoria's business cards that I'd been keeping in my pocket specifically for this moment. Melissa looked uncomfortable, kept glancing between Gia and Godwin like she was seeing something she didn't want to see. And she asked quietly if maybe they should give us privacy. But Gia snapped at her, said no. They need to hear this. He needs to understand what he's destroying. And I realized right then that Gia had completely rewritten the narrative in her head. She genuinely believed I was the villain here, that I was the one breaking up our marriage over her generous gesture of carrying another man's child. My brother started carrying boxes down to his truck, and I followed with my own stuff. And Gia tried to block the doorway, said I couldn't just leave, that we had a lease together, that we had responsibilities, and I reminded her that according to the divorce papers she'd been served 4 hours ago, I was well within my rights to leave, that I'd already paid my half of the rent through the end of the lease, that everything from this point forward went through our lawyers, and she started crying. Again, real tears this time, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this, why I wouldn't just support her, why I had to ruin everything. I moved past her with my last box and stopped at the door, turned back and looked at all 3 of them standing in my living room. Gia with tears running down her face, Godwin with his arm around her shoulders in a way that was definitely not appropriate for someone's ex-boyfriend, Melissa looking lost and confused. And I said, "You made your choice, Gia. You chose him. You chose this. And now you get to live with it." And I walked out and didn't look back. I moved into my brother's spare room that night, and it felt like freedom, felt like the first honest place I'd been in weeks. And my brother ordered pizza, and we sat up until 2 a.m. drinking beer and talking about everything. About how blind I'd been, about how calculated Gia's betrayal was, about how I was going to rebuild my life from scratch at 32. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and document signings and asset divisions. And Victoria was vicious. She found out that Gia had already spent $20,000 on the surrogacy process, money from her own savings that she'd kept secret, money she'd been setting aside for months apparently, which proved this wasn't a sudden decision but a long-planned betrayal. And Victoria used that in court, showed the judge that Gia had been planning this behind my back for potentially over a year. We also discovered that Gia had moved out of our apartment completely, packed up all her stuff in one weekend while I was at my brother's place, and moved in with Godwin and Melissa into their house like some kind of sister-wife situation. And Victoria said this proved inappropriate relationship dynamics, proved everything we needed to prove. The court date arrived 6 weeks after I'd filed. Fastest divorce hearing Victoria had ever gotten apparently. And I sat there in my only suit watching Gia on the other side of the courtroom with her lawyer, some guy who looked fresh out of law school and completely overwhelmed. And when the judge asked Gia directly if she'd consulted with her husband before agreeing to be a surrogate for her ex-boyfriend, she had to admit she hadn't. Had to admit she'd met with them multiple times without telling me. Had to admit she'd already started the medical process. And the judge's face was stone cold, completely unimpressed. Victoria brought up the fact that Gia had moved in with Godwin and Melissa, that she'd withdrawn $20,000 from her personal savings without disclosure, that she'd refused marriage counseling, and Gia's lawyer tried to argue that I'd been unnecessarily cruel, that freezing accounts and removing insurance was vindictive. But Victoria countered that I'd only frozen accounts I'd personally contributed to, that I'd only removed her from insurance policies I paid for, that everything I'd done was completely legal and frankly restrained considering the circumstances. The judge took 15 minutes to deliberate, came back, and said, "Mrs. Foster, you have destroyed your marriage through your actions. You made major life decisions without your husband's input. You prioritized your ex-boyfriend over your spouse." And while Mr. Foster's response was swift and harsh, he acted within his legal rights. And then came the part that made it all worth it: the division of assets. We had about $70,000 in combined savings and investments, built up over 6 years of marriage. And Victoria had argued that since I'd been the primary earner and Gia had already secretly withdrawn $20,000 for her surrogacy plan, the division should reflect that. And the judge agreed, awarded me $55,000 and gave Gia just $15,000. And I watched her face crumble when she heard that. Watched her realize that her grand romantic gesture had cost her everything: her marriage, her home, her financial security, all for Godwin. All for a man who was sitting in the back of the courtroom with his wife looking increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation. I walked out of that courthouse a free man, divorced, single, $45,000 richer after legal fees, and Victoria shook my hand and said, "You stood up for yourself when it mattered." And I felt it, felt the weight lifting, felt like I could finally breathe again, like the last 2 months of hell had been worth it just to get to this moment, this feeling of absolute liberation. 6 months passed after the divorce was finalized, 6 months of me rebuilding my entire life from scratch, and I'd moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, got a promotion at work because I was suddenly putting in crazy hours with nothing else to do, started going to the gym religiously, even went on a few dates though nothing serious, and I thought I was done with the whole Gia saga, thought that chapter was closed forever, and then my phone rang on a random Tuesday evening and the caller ID said Melissa, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, some weird intuition that this wasn't a social call. Melissa's voice was shaking when she spoke. She was crying, and she said she needed to tell me something I deserved to know, something that had been eating at her for months, and I sat down on my couch because I could tell this was going to be bad, could hear it in her voice, that desperate need to confess that people get when they can't carry a secret anymore. She told me she was divorcing Godwin, that she'd filed papers 3 days ago, and that she'd found evidence, actual proof, that Godwin and Gia had been having an affair the entire time, that the surrogacy was never really about surrogacy at all. It was a cover story, a way for them to be together, a way for Gia to have Godwin's baby while pretending it was some noble gesture. And my stomach dropped even though I'd suspected something like this, even though I'd known deep down that the whole situation was wrong. Hearing it confirmed was different, was worse somehow. Melissa kept talking, words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in too long. And she explained that she'd found text messages going back over a year, messages between Godwin and Gia that were definitely not appropriate for exes or friends, messages talking about how they'd never stopped loving each other, how they'd made a mistake breaking up in college, how they wished they could be together. And then 3 months before the Olive Garden incident, they'd started planning how to make this happen, how to get Gia pregnant with Godwin's baby without anyone questioning it. The surrogacy story was perfect, gave them an excuse to be together constantly, to have medical appointments together, to be intimate in a clinical setting. Except Melissa had found emails to a fertility clinic that weren't part of their official surrogacy plan, found evidence that Godwin and Gia had gone to a different doctor, had done their own procedure, had essentially created their own baby and planned to pass it off as a surrogate pregnancy. And Melissa had only discovered all this because she'd found a second phone that Godwin had hidden in his car, a burner phone with months of messages and photos that proved everything. I sat there processing this information, this revelation that my ex-wife hadn't just wanted to be a surrogate. She'd wanted to have her ex-boyfriend's baby and raise it with him, wanted to completely blow up 2 marriages for some twisted fairy tale reunion. And Melissa was apologizing to me, saying she should have known, should have questioned things, should have talked to me before any of this started. But Godwin had assured her that everything was legitimate, that my wife and I were on board, that everyone was on the same page. I asked Melissa what she was going to do with this information, and she said she'd already done it. She'd filed a lawsuit against both Godwin and Gia for fraud and emotional distress, had sent all the evidence to a lawyer, had contacted the fertility clinic they'd used, and the whole thing was about to become very public, very messy, very career-destroying for both of them. And I won't lie, hearing that gave me a savage sense of satisfaction, of justice, of cosmic karma finally catching up to the people who tried to destroy my life. The news broke 2 weeks later. Local news picked up the story. Former couple commits surrogacy fraud. was the headline I saw when my brother sent me the link, and there were photos of Godwin and Gia leaving court, both of them looking destroyed. And apparently Godwin had lost his job at the engineering firm where he'd worked for 8 years, couldn't survive the scandal. And Gia had been let go from her position at the marketing agency, something about bringing negative publicity to the company. And they were both facing a lawsuit from Melissa that could cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. I didn't follow the case obsessively, but I heard updates through mutual friends, heard that Godwin and Gia had moved in together officially, that they were broke, that they were struggling, that the baby had been born, a daughter, perfectly healthy but born into absolute chaos. And I felt nothing, no anger, no sadness, no jealousy, just a weird, empty relief that I'd gotten out when I did, that I wasn't tied to that disaster, that I'd chosen to save myself instead of drowning with them. 8 months after Melissa's phone call, I was at a coffee shop near my apartment, a place I'd started going every Saturday morning for their espresso, and I was reading on my tablet when someone sat down across from me. And I looked up, and it was Gia, looking exhausted and older somehow, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes, and she had a baby carrier next to her with a sleeping infant inside. We stared at each other for a long moment, and she asked if she could talk to me, just for 5 minutes, and I should have said no, should have gotten up and left, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what she could possibly say to justify everything she'd done, everything she'd destroyed. Gia looked down at her coffee cup and started talking, her voice quiet and defeated, and she told me everything. That she'd been in love with Godwin the whole time we were married, that she'd reconnected with him 2 years ago at a college reunion and they'd started their affair shortly after, that the surrogacy was a cover story they'd concocted together, that she'd lied to everyone including Melissa, including me, including herself about what she was really doing. She said she'd convinced herself it was romantic, that it was some great love story, that fighting for the person you really loved was noble and brave. But now she saw it for what it was, selfish and destructive and cruel, and she'd lost everything, her marriage, her career, her reputation, her friends, even Godwin, who'd turned out to be not the fairy tale prince she'd built up in her head, but just a cheater and a liar like her. I listened to all of this without interrupting, and when she finished, she looked at me with these desperate eyes and said, "You were a better husband than I deserved, better than I appreciated, and I threw it all away for a fantasy that wasn't even real." And I could tell she wanted me to say something comforting, wanted absolution, wanted me to tell her it was okay or that I forgave her, but I didn't feel any of those things. I felt distant and detached, like I was watching a stranger confess to crimes that had happened to someone else. I stood up and picked up my tablet and looked down at her and her baby, this child that could have been mine in another life, in another timeline where Gia had been honest and faithful. And I said, "You made your choices, Gia. You destroyed everything yourself. I just refused to go down with you." And I walked away, left her sitting there in that coffee shop with her baby and her regrets. And I didn't look back because there was nothing back there for me anymore, nothing but ashes and mistakes, and a life I'd successfully escaped. That night I had a date with a woman named Rachel who worked in graphic design, our 5th date, and we went to a nice Italian restaurant, not Olive Garden, never Olive Garden again. And over wine and pasta I realized I was happy, excited about my future, grateful for everything that had happened because it had led me here, to this moment, to this freedom. My real revenge wasn't the divorce or the money or watching Gia's life fall apart. My real revenge was being happy while she lived with the consequences of every terrible choice she'd made. And that felt better than any legal victory, better than any amount of money, better than anything I could have planned or orchestrated, because it was real, it was earned, it was mine, and nobody could take it away from me. Not Gia, not Godwin, not anyone. And that realization, sitting across from Rachel, while she laughed at something I had said, that was the real ending to this story, not dramatic or explosive, but quiet and true and perfect. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.